Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ninth episode of TCN Presents the Cultured Pull List. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book One. This includes the first several comics, Swamp Thing comics that Alan Moore worked on. So, yeah, let's just jump right into it. Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are nearing the end of our journey of going through the comics and books that are informing the new DCU under James Gunn, and we're finally to Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. Now, had you read any of these before? Before we
No,
started?
I haven't. I haven't read much Swamp Thing in general, but specifically, like I as reading this, let me get my words straight here. I definitely was aware of a lot of these things. Like
Yeah.
there's one part I think early on in this volume where it's kind of revealed that he's not the
Yes.
person. He's just sort of his consciousness was transformed into a
Yes.
plant, and like at this point, everybody kind of knows that. But I guess back in the
Mhm.
80s, that was sort of a big revelation.
Yeah, that was one of the big changes Alan Moore made, like one of his
Yeah.
big stamps to Swamp Thing.
Hmm.
Because the Alec Holland version of Swamp Thing, like for anybody who doesn't know, like very brief history lesson on Swamp Thing. For the Alec Holland version, which is the most widely accepted version
Hmm.
nowadays, started in the 70s, and then they revitalized the series again in 82 because the movie was coming out, the live action movie.
Right.
And then they just kind of dropped it for a couple years. They got to like issue like 19 and dropped it. And then
Hmm.
Alan Moore came on board and started writing. And so he started with issue 20, which for some reason issue 20 hasn't been reprinted that many times. Like I guess it didn't get reprinted till like 2009, which is really weird.
Interesting. So it
Yeah,
was like a couple of months between 19 and 20 then, because it was a different.
I believe it was like a couple years.
Oh, really?
So
Interesting.
yes, yeah. So like 82 was when they
Uh-huh.
kind of dropped off, and the 84 is when Alan Moore picked up. And
Oh, okay.
he added his own stuff, but also tried to pick up, where the characters
Mm.
left off. So I'm gonna just give a brief, like just kind of talking about the um, characters that show up because it kind of just jumps into the middle of their story.
Yeah.
So it was a little confusing at first, but so there's Abby Arcane. Well, actually, Abby Cable, but she is the niece of Anton Arcane, who is one of Swamp Thing's biggest enemies.
Mm.
She's married to Matt Cable, and during this portion of the story, she has a growing relationship with Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
Kind of seems like she's kind of has feelings for Alec, even though he's a swamp person.
Hmm.
But then there's Matt Cable, who's a government agent or a former government agent. He was part of like this failed government program, but the stuff they did to him messed up his brain and drove him to alcoholism, and also
Hmm.
gave him the ability to basically manifest his thoughts into like constructs,
Right.
which is kind of weird, but that's
Hmm.
how it works, I guess. Then there's also Liz Tremaine, who is she started out as a tabloid journalist. She ended up running into the Swamp Thing and was kind of responsible for sending him to this clinic. But it turns
Mm.
out the clinic was owned by the Sunderland Corporation,
Okay.
who is kind of like one of the big bads that Alan Moore set up. Avery Sunderland and his Sunderland Corporation. But
Mhm.
Liz and Dennis ended up helping Swamp Thing escape and left Sunderland. Dennis Barclay is a former doctor at Sunderland Corp and the Sunderland Corporation, and apparently he has psychic healing abilities. Um,
Okay.
and so he and Liz are kind of a team.
Mhm.
They're kind of companions at this point. And where this picks up, Anton Arcane had kidnapped his niece Abby, and
Mhm.
there had been this big showdown between Swamp Thing and Anton,
Yeah.
and it seems like Anton's ship basically like crashed, and
Mm.
Abby, Swamp Thing saved Abby, and that's pretty much where it picks up.
Mhm.
But I did just want to say real quick that like I didn't know this before reading this, but the Swamp Thing DC Universe series, the live action series,
Oh yeah.
is very heavily based on this Alan Moore run.
Okay.
Because as you can see, he's holding Alec Holland's body. They really leaned into a lot of the stuff that Alan Moore did, like making Swamp Thing was no longer Alec Holland turned into Swamp Thing. It was technically Swamp Thing was like a plant creature who had some of the memories of Alec Holland and thought he was Holland.
Yeah.
I did forget to mention Matt Cable at one point. He actually becomes Matthew the Raven. And
Okay.
Sandman. Later on, spoiler, he dies, and he somehow he ends up in the dreaming after he dies, and Morpheus gives him the option to become a Raven. So I thought that was interesting. I didn't really know that until I looked into him more.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's jump into some of these facts here. We got Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 1. That's what we're going through today. Writer is Alan Moore, like we already said. The artists are Stephen Bissett, John Totleben, Dan Day, and Rick Veitch. And the colorist is Tatiana Wood. The letterers are John Costanza and Todd Klein. Now, the book we're going through was first published in April 2012, this first compilation. But the original comics came out in 1984. I believe starting in January 1984, and then just, month to month from there. So we pick up right after Anton Arcane's ship, whatever it was, fell from the sky and crashed into the mountains. And Swamp Thing is searching the wreckage for his body. And surprise, surprise, he finds the body, which apparently is like the third time Anton Arcane has died in the comics.
Okay.
So, yeah, he just keeps coming back. And the funny thing is he comes back again. But so he finds Anton's body, and that seems to be the end of Arcane for now. Then we cut to General Avery Sunderland, who is basically explaining to his army buddy that he's just sending a bunch of people to kill. He's sending a bunch of people to kill Swamp Thing, Abby, Matt, and Liz. And he seems to be using the Coast Guard to do a lot of it, as well as his own assassins. So, and we see here that it's just the National Guard preparing to go to the Bayou Swamps to go after Swamp Thing. So then we cut to Liz Tremaine and Dennis. They're camping out here. Not really camping out, but they're in a motel in the I think near the Bayou Swamps, and not really sure what's going on here because it kind of picks up from I think the last comics.
I was very confused in the beginning as well.
Yes, but it seems like their van broke down. It seems like they kind of got hot and heavy at some point, but Liz isn't really sure that they have much of a connection outside of what they're doing with the whole trying to help Alec. And Dennis isn't super happy about that, and he kind of storms off when she tells him that because he really wants to. I guess he really likes her. So then we go to Abby and Matt. Abby, who had just been saved by Swamp Thing and escaped from her uncle, goes back to her home and cozies up to Matt. But it's not exactly an argument, but she's not super happy about his drinking. He says that he's got it under control, but she doesn't really believe him. And so he's looking to have some sexy time there, and Abby isn't having it. So she ends up leaving the house, and he ends up breaking open a drink and using his weird powers. He kind of makes his own lap dance kind of thing, which is interesting. So then we go back to Dennis and Liz, and they're trying to go back to their motel. They're trying to check out of the motel, and Liz is trying to get Dennis's bag out of the room, but some random Good Samaritan guy just goes into the room for them and is like, "Oh, I'll get the bag for you, little lady," kind of thing. And it turns out that the room was wired to explode by Sunderland's men. So as soon as this guy goes in there, he gets blown up instead of Dennis and Liz. So Dennis and Liz escape. Meanwhile, at Abby and Matt's home, the National Guard helicopters show up, and Matt hears them, runs out of the house to find Abby, who's already out in the woods, and they blow up their house. So they're wasting no time coming after everybody, but they're still 0 for 2 right now. So then we cut to the bayou where Swamp Thing is fighting the National Guard. At first, he kind of takes a stealthy approach, but then he just straight up just starts like downing helicopters and whatnot. And it gets to the point where he's being overwhelmed by all of the soldiers and equipment they have. So he tries to escape, and he ends up getting shot like multiple times. He just gets overwhelmed and shot multiple times and seemingly dies. And we pick up in the next issue where Avery Sunderland has Swamp Thing's body cooling in a liquid nitrogen chest, basically. And he brings in, his name is Jason Woodrue, Dr. Woodrue, and he is the villain Floronic Man, which I'm not sure when exactly he showed up before.
Yeah, but it seems like he has a bit of a history.
Yeah, like he's already Floronic Man. He's already had some like bio accident, like this biochemical accident that turned him into a plant person, basically. And he has this like spray on skin that you can kind of see here, and he can like melt it away. But all this is being told kind of in a flashback, because at the present time, Jason Woodrue is in his apartment recalling all this happening a few weeks before. So Sunderland shows him the body, and he wants Woodrue to basically perform an autopsy on Swamp Thing and figure out how to extract the special serum that he was making, which I did kind of forget to mention earlier. So Alec Holland's like origin thing basically is that he was a doctor. He and his wife were trying to make a special serum that was going to regenerate plant life and basically make hunger on Earth a thing of the past. But while they were working on this, terrorists attacked their lab and planted a bomb inside. They had knocked Alec out, so when he woke up, he saw the bomb, but it was too late. He got caught up in the explosion and the chemicals that they were working on. And, you know, he just like basically with like his death throes, he ran outside and fell into the Louisiana bog. And that's, you know, how he became Swamp Thing. So what Sunderland wants is that regeneration serum, basically, that only works on plants, that Holland was working on. They tried exhuming his wife's body, who was murdered soon after Alec supposedly died, and they couldn't get any of the serum out of her body, even though she'd been exposed to it, because it only works on plant life. So he's thinking, well, if we can, you know, cut open Swamp Thing, we can get the serum out of him. So weeks go by. Woodrue performs the autopsy, but he finds a bunch of human-like organs inside, but none of them actually work or function. They're not really meant to. They seem to just be kind of fake copies of you know, like plant versions of what these human organs should be, but they can't actually function with the tissue that they're made of. So this kind of stumps Woodrue for a while, and there's even like a contemplative shower scene where we see him in all his Floronic Man glory, which is kind of hideous. And he kind of keeps bringing his findings to Sunderland, who basically keeps threatening him, like, you know, if you don't make results, I could have you arrested, yada yada, just kind of being a right prick. And Woodrue, he ends up reading something about planarian worms, about how there was this study, which I actually like looked into it. This is actually a real study. Some guy in like 1960 ended up putting these, basically training these planarian worms to go through this maze he set up. And they're a carnivorous form of planarian worms. So he ended up cutting up the worm that he trained and feeding it to other worms, and they
Yeah.
seemed to have the memory to navigate the maze from that. And
Mhm.
so Woodrow took that idea and applied it to Swamp Thing and came to the realization that Swamp Thing is really just a plant being, basically, that
Mhm.
thinks it's Alec Holland. Like during the accident, basically Alec's body decomposed into the plant life, and seemingly like the mix of the chemicals and whatever else just kind of melded some of his consciousness with the plant life. And so they tried to make as close to, a human body as it was able to. So that's why he has like fake
Mm.
organs and looks humanoid and everything.
Right.
So Woodrow, yeah, here's the shows the accident
Mm.
and shows Swamp Thing kind of forming.
Yeah.
So Woodrow brings all this to Sunderland's attention, and Sunderland. Whoops, let's go back here. There we go. Sunderland happy and basically fires Woodrow,
Mm.
but before Woodrow can tell him that this means Swamp Thing is alive and just kind of in a hibernative state because of the liquid nitrogen they're pumping in there.
Right.
So when Sunderland leaves his office, Woodrow ends up turning off the nitrogen cooling system,
Mhm.
and Swamp Thing begins to sprout basically out of
Yeah.
the husk and is kind of coming back to life.
Mhm.
And this kind of all takes place like Woodrow is imagining this because he's this is basically his revenge on Sunderland, and he's
Mhm.
kind of enjoying it from the safety of his own apartment. So we do see it happening though in real time. Sunderland goes down to Swamp Thing's body, sees that he broke out, goes back to his office where Swamp Thing is waiting for him. He kind of
Mhm.
tries to placate, he kind of tries to calm Swamp Thing and asks him if he read Woodrow's file, and he says, "Yep." And so he's not too happy. So Swamp Thing ends up chasing Sunderland like um, all around the labs and the building and everything, and ends up killing Sunderland.
Mhm.
And that is where that book leaves off. And I did forget to mention earlier, but that book, it was titled The Anatomy Lesson,
Yeah.
and it's become kind of an iconic Swamp Thing story because
Yeah.
of the
And
introduction.
rightfully so. It's probably
Yeah,
my favorite of this whole bunch.
yeah, it's very interesting. Like the way Woodrow is kind of narrating the whole thing is interesting, and
Mhm.
just like the way it introduces kind of that new origin,
Yeah.
or at least new way of understanding Swamp Thing is pretty interesting.
Mhm.
So the next issue picks up where Abby and Matt have gone to the bayou to hopefully find Alec alive, but instead they do find Alec. Well, technically Swamp Thing, but he's in a very catatonic state
Mhm.
and has kind of started becoming one with the foliage around him.
Yeah.
And Woodrow has seemingly been studying him while he has been here, and reveals himself to Abby and Matt, and kind of explains that he's come here. He learned that he's not really Alec Holland, and that was kind of his only reason for living, was trying to figure out how to become human again.
Mhm.
So now he's just kind of in this catatonic state, kind of turning back into a plant, basically.
Yeah.
He's kind of not under the illusion that he's human anymore, so he's just kind of morphing back into plant. And he shows them like these almost like potato-like um,
Mm. Yeah.
growths that he thinks are probably edible, growing out of Swamp Thing's body. And Abby is pretty upset about this because she's friends with Alec and kind of has a thing for him. So there's all that. Once Abby and Matt go back to their motel, Abby almost catches Matt doing some weird ass shit with his powers.
Mm.
Like she hears a female voice in their room and like gets upset, but when she actually comes in, Matt's just sitting there like, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" But he was clearly doing some other stuff before that.
Yeah.
And we also see Jason Woodrue take those growths from Swamp Thing and make a meal out of it, which is definitely a choice there. During all this too, Swamp Thing is kind of going through. He's having like these weird dreams kind of thing going on. It seems like he's going into his own psyche is the idea. But he's back at his wedding, but a bunch of people that he doesn't know, like he didn't know yet, are there. Like it's obviously not. There's something not right, and then his wife Linda ends up almost dying. He ends up like having to kind of like put on a Swamp Thing suit to go and save her, and ends up meeting these sentient, well, not sentient, but talking planarian worms. It seems like it's kind of combining, his experiences with the new stuff he's learned about himself. The file that Woodrue made that he read, and he ends up taking this skeleton, which is supposed to represent his humanity, and he ends up kind of protecting that and trying to fend off a bunch of monsters throughout the rest of his dream or vision or whatever you want to call it. Then we also see Abby and Matt go back to it just seems like to kind of say goodbye to Alec, or at least just to see him again. And Woodrue kind of is hiding in the trees, waiting for them to leave so that he can take this flower growing off of Swamp Thing. And somehow he has some machine that he created. I'm assuming that he's able to use the flower to basically connect to Swamp Thing, who was connected to the green. And that is basically Woodrue's plan the whole time, because he's a plant person, but he doesn't really have the same connection to plant life that Swamp Thing has. And he really wants that. So he basically uses Swamp Thing as like a go-between, like a conduit to be able to access plant life, which in the wider DC universe, we do know that it's called the green.
Yeah.
So he's basically trying to tap into the green, but it ends up being too much for him. And he just gets overwhelmed with everything because he can basically tap into all plant life, like on the planet.
Right.
And he just kind of goes crazy, and his mind ends up breaking. And then we go to the next issue, where it seems like Swamp Thing has kind of come to peace with, just floating around in the green. His consciousness just kind of floating around, but he ends up sensing this other kind of malignant force that's taken root in the green. And he says it's red, but we know that it's Floronic Man. It's Woodrue. But Woodrue ends up just kind of going on this crazy rampage. There are these kids hanging out in a car nearby near the swamp, and he ends up just killing them for no real reason. Abby ends up going back to the swamp. She's just kind of obsessed with Alec, seems like, and she comes back to the swamp, ends up seeing the boys' bodies, and then the roots and the plant life start actually attacking her. And she calls for Alec to help, but he doesn't hear her, at least not yet. So Floronic Man, Woodrue, goes to a nearby town, the nearest town, and basically just kind of takes over the town, kind of takes the town hostage, forces one of the townspeople to film him, making a statement or like an ultimatum, basically. And he also makes everybody, or almost everybody, go back into their homes, where they seem to think they're safe, but he also commands the plants, like all the plant life in the town, to increase their O2, their oxygen output, and as soon as somebody lights a lighter to light their cigarette, it just makes basically the whole town explode. And we then cut to Swamp Thing, who finally wakes up and saves Abby from the plants that are attacking her. And the kid that filmed Woodrue ends up escaping to another town, and he gives the videotape. He goes to the police station and gives the videotape to the police there, who watch the video and are so shook by it, they end up calling the nearest city, who then calls Washington, who then call the Justice League. And we then cut back to Woodrue, who is still just on a rampage throughout the town. And the townspeople ask him to stop, but then he kind of gives this long-winded speech. It's kind of like the Lorax if he were a domestic terrorist.
Right.
You know, just kind of talking about, like, you know, humans have abused plant life and the earth and everything, and now it's time for them to pay. And he basically seems like he wants to just kill all humans on the planet. And right after he's kind of in the middle of his speech when Swamp Thing shows up and says, "Woodrue, no more." It's this really cool shot. It's a showdown about to happen, and that is where I'm going to stop, and you can pick up there, Luke.
Yeah, so this issue opens up with the Justice League getting the information that we saw last issue. And there's basically like, well, we know this guy, and this is like nothing we've ever seen from this man before. Like we mentioned, Floronic Man has a history in the DCU, and apparently like he wasn't like a really big villain. This happens sometimes, a lot of the times where like there was this kind of like a C tier villain from like decades ago, but then they bring him back and he's like different or stronger or whatever.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the Sandman, where Dr. Destiny is brought back to be like a big villain.
Yeah. And then there's this panel over here. I took a picture of it because I was looking at this side right here, and then there's Green Arrow is like, wasn't there that superhero with the Titans called Blackbird? And I'm like, wait, who's Blackbird? I was thinking, Blackbird.
You mean Raven.
I look over the next panel. I was like, oh, he's talking about Raven.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. That's kind of funny.
And so we pick up where we left off. Woodrow was like, oh, hey, you're here to join me and take over the Earth and kill all the humans. And Swamp Thing's like, no, I'm here to fight you and stop the humans. And while this is happening, Abby is talking to this guy, and he's like, I have to go get Evangeline. And we're like, who's Evangeline? And then later on, he comes back, and he's like, this is Evangeline. He's holding his massive chainsaw. It's really funny. It's really, really funny. But ultimately, Woodrow just ends up killing him, so it doesn't really do anything. But it's
that's
still really, really funny.
Kind of anticlimactic there, but
yeah. And so they basically go back and forth, and they fight. And he's like, yeah, I'm kind of covering it up over here, but he's like, I'm no longer Alec. I'm Swamp Thing. He's like, yeah, you're not helping. You're actually hurting the Green, and you think you're like doing what you want, doing what the Green wants, but really you're just hurting it. And he's basically Swamp Thing's basically like, well, when all the human and animals die, and all of the and you convert all of the molecules to oxygen, and then like who's going to turn it back for the plants to breathe? And Woodrow's like, oh yeah, you're right.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. And then he gets that skin stuff you were talking about, and the Justice League come back because now they can breathe again. He's like, look at me, but it's like weird, as you can see, and they're like, yeah, okay, we'll just take you to Arkham. And that's kind of how it ends. And this is the final panel of the issue. He's talking to Abby. He's like, yeah, Alec Holland is dead, and I just kind of have his memories now, and I think I'm kind of okay with that. So he basically comes into like his own. He fully like is okay with himself. He realizes what he is, and he kind of just moves on. And then this next issue begins the arc called down here the Sleep of Reason. And so the opening panel is very interesting. It's basically this traveling like insurance guy or whatever. He's trying to give off his lofts cards or whatever. And he says, by the way, Selena doesn't like the lawn chairs, and you're gonna get stabbed by a swordfish at 5:30. Bye. And he's talking to this guy. Nice. It was really weird. And then we cut back to Abby, and she's like, well, I just got this new job at a mental institution, and I really like it. I'm working with some kids. And then something's like, yeah, that's cool. Good for you. Yeah, and then so this is the one kid that she's working with. He's 6 years old, and he's writing pictures, and they're kind of weird pictures, as you can see. He's like, if you spell wrong, the Monkey King's going to kill you, so don't spell wrong.
Nice. Looks like he's 6 going on 40.
Exactly. Yeah. And then so there's this flashback of his parents because they died, and that's why he's in the institution. And they're messing around with an Ouija board, and we'll learn more about that later. Like, because this is one of the issues, kind of like what we did with the Grant Morrison Batman, where there's like a bunch of little pieces, and they don't really know how they fit together until the end, and they all kind of fall into place.
Yeah, right.
So there's like a swordfish, there's lawn chairs, a Ouija boards, like it all makes sense later. Anyway, yeah. So then we cut to this couple, and they are at this auction place, and they mentioned that the stuff that's being auctioned off was owned by a couple that was that died in their house, and so they're basically auctioning off their furniture. And so it turns out that this woman over here is named Selena, and she didn't like the lawn furniture that was being auctioned off. So she's like, well, let's get this thing instead. And her husband's like, it's ugly, and like he's really not happy with it. And so they can't fit it in the car, so they end up tying it to the roof of their car. And we cut back to the guy from the very beginning. Oh, too far. We cut back to the guy from the very beginning, and he's talking to Abby in the street, and he steps out in front of the car, and they break, and then the swordfish it stabs him, and he dies.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah. And so it turns out that the family who owned the swordfish were, I don't remember his name, but it was this kid's I can't remember his name. But it was his parents, and they were playing with an Ouija board, and they summoned, I don't know if I have the panel. Oh yeah, the Monkey King. And he's this weird guy, and he killed both of his parents. And so that's what this kid, everyone thinks he's crazy, but he actually saw this weird demon monkey guy. And so the loft salesman is trying to get Abby's attention, and she's like, I don't want to hear it. But it turns out that he's actually Jason Blood. So
right.
And at the beginning of the next issue, they are drinking tea, and she's kind of like, I'm done with all this weird stuff that's going on in my life. I'm going to quit working here at the school. I'm sorry, not at the school. It's an asylum.
Yeah.
And Jason's like, no, you should really help because there's a lot of strange stuff happening, and we kind of need your help here. But he's also he's basically it's sort of like the Hulk these panels are out of order. It's sort of like the Hulk situation where he's kind of like internally warring with himself with this demon.
Yeah.
He's basically, I'll try to help you, but I don't want to hurt these kids. And then so she goes back to work, and she realizes that now more of the kids besides just Paul are writing about this Monkey King. And she's like, she goes to Paul, and she's like, what's going on here? Okay. And Paul basically says, well, now the Monkey King is harassing all of the children. And then she goes back to her husband that night. I don't know if I have a panel of her husband, but she goes back to her husband that night, and he's like, Matt's like, why don't you just stop? All these kids are weird. This asylum's weird. Just stop.
Yeah.
And she's like, no, I think they need my help. And he's like, yeah, whatever. And she's just kind of sick of him. And so she tries to be like understanding, but then she says that then she goes to the Swamp Thing for help. And Swamp Thing kind of already has an inclination of what's happening, so that they try to rush to the school, but as they reach there, they realize it was too late. And then the Jason Blood turns into the demon, and they start fighting. The Monkey King also shows up, and so they fight for a little bit, but then yeah, I believe that Swamp Thing and Trajan, and how do you say that guy's name, the demon name?
Etrigan.
That's right. They get into a fight as well. He loses and then but then Matt, yeah, these panels are totally out of order. And then Matt's like, I feel sorry, I should probably go and talk to Abby, but then he wrecks his car, and he's smashing it into a tree. And then issue 27, I believe, starts right here, I think. Yeah, these last couple issues, I'm sorry, they're all out of order. Yeah, so basically, I think what happens at the end of the last issue, Swamp Thing and the demons start fighting, and then they team up and fight the Monkey King. And Matt kind of wakes up in a state of delirium, and then he realizes that he's bleeding to death.
Oh, gee.
And a giant fly, which is what we see right here, comes to speak to him, claiming that death is not necessarily the only escape. And then so Abby and Paul rush to the swamp, and then the Etrigan appears, having left the Swamp Thing to battle the Monkey King. He knows of the creature's mental connection with Paul and believes that he can stop by killing Paul as like a sacrifice kind of thing. But before he can do that, Swamp Thing returns and attacks him. In the confusion, Abby and Paul run further towards the swamp. Unfortunately, the Monkey King soon finds them. And then the Fly explains that Matt's going to bleed to death, and to stop this, he has to agree to do something. He has to kind of make a deal to the Fly, basically. And Matt's like, well, obviously I want to live, and so whatever you want to do, just do it. And so he's very obviously he's at the brink of death, so he's like, I want to make a deal with you.
Right.
And then so he opens his mouth, and the Fly kind of like crawls inside of his body. Super weird, like.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Abby's by herself now, and the Monkey King attacks her, but it takes on the form of her husband, Matt.
Oh. Okay.
And yeah, and then so basically Paul is so basically at this point we kind of have an understanding that the Monkey King, this Monkey King guy, is sort of the like embodiment of fear, and he's sort of like Pennywise in the sense that he sort of like manipulates people's fear, right? And so at this point, Paul kind of comes out and says, well, I'm not afraid anymore. And he kind of manipulates the Monkey King into taking smaller and smaller forms until finally Etrigan plucks it from Paul's fingers and he eats it, basically. A lot of mouth stuff going on in this issue, and I don't know how to feel about it. Yeah, but then before leaving, Etrigan warns that whatever influenced Paul's parents to summon the Monkey King is a problem that they're going to have to deal with in the future. And then Abby sends Swamp Thing and Paul back to the asylum. Yeah, and then so at this point, Etrigan transforms back into Jason Blood. And he's like, yeah, I kind of have this issue where I turn into a demon sometimes. It's kind of whatever.
Yeah, it's no big deal.
Yeah, everyone does it from time to time.
Yeah.
But he's like, sometimes it's not all bad. Like, he helped save the day in this case. So it's, there's a little give and take.
Yeah.
At the end, Abby walks home in the rain when Matt drives up in an undamaged car. He apologizes, and they drive home together. So
I'm guessing it's probably soon after this, but I'm pretty sure the deal that Matt had to make was letting Anton Arcane's soul basically take over his body. And that's kind of what happens for a while. Anton Arcane is in Matt's body, and it's kind of creepy because he's technically married to his niece, but he doesn't announce himself as Arcane. He just pretends to be Matt for a while.
And that's one of the ththings I really like about this is that it's so strange, but it plays it very seriously.
Yeah,
and I just really like that.
Yeah, I feel like Alan Moore's some of his best stuff is in this kind of weird, macabre kind of supernatural stuff.
Yeah,
because he's kind of a weird guy.
Yeah,
and his writing gets pretty weird, so I think it works really well with this kind of a more horror kind of stuff. But yeah, what are your thoughts on our delve through Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run?
Yeah, I really liked it. Again, like it's that kind of 80s comic book style that I really, really like. And like I mentioned, the horror elements are really cool. And I feel like those first 3 or 4 I don't remember, but the first arc with Woodrow would really translate really well into a movie. And I feel like it's one of those things where it's not really an origin story, kind of like the Batman, but it's more, it still informs the audience about the character in a way that an origin story would, without like treading over kind of the origin story tropes per se.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious how they're going to adapt it into the movie. If they're going to go through the origin, or if it's going to be more like what you just said, the Woodrue story arc, where it's like the autopsy,
Right.
or if they're just going to kind of like meld a bunch of stuff together, which is probably what they're going to do. They're probably going to meld a bunch of this Swamp Thing stories together, which I think was really cool about Swamp Thing. The characters, he has so many of the supernatural kind of characters that he ends up dealing with. Like in this series alone, we have Etrigan. Constantine shows up at some point. So does Phantom Stranger and Blue Devil, I believe. So it's I have always I've always kind of been drawn to like the more supernatural characters. And I think DC's super good at it. I think Marvel's supernatural are like hit or miss for me, but I really like pretty much all the supernatural and magic DC characters. And I think some of the most interesting stories are like that, or with those characters, So I definitely really enjoyed this. I didn't really realize it, but it seems like Alan Moore's run is kind of what I think of when I think of Swamp Thing.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Part of that, I'm sure, is probably because of the series. But yeah, this series took a lot of inspiration from this run. But yeah, and I thought the art was really cool. It reminded me a lot of the Sandman art, art from the Sandman books. It's kind of just like a 80s DC style that was pretty cool. Especially, and the Hellraiser books too. Very similar art style to all of those, the Constantine, or not Hellblazer, not Hellraiser.
Hellblazer. Okay.
There we go. I was like, wait a minute. No, that isn't right. Yeah. So yeah, I thought this was really cool. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how they translate this into a movie. The thing is, I think they did it so well. Like, you haven't seen the series, right?
No.
Yeah, they did such a good job, I think, with the series. It's honestly a shame I didn't get a second season, because it's honestly a super good adaptation of Swamp Thing. Like, the practical effects are so good. That is such a good job, and it's very similar. Kind of follows a similar route. Like, they obviously make a lot of changes, but almost all the characters in this story are in it. Plus a few others, and some characters like Phantom Stranger shows up, and so does Blue Devil. It's actually pretty interesting. And even at the end, Jason Woodrue turns into Floronic Man, which the whole time he's just a normal scientist. But yeah, it's very cool, and I kind of hope they take a similar approach to the movie, like similar tone, kind of a horror tone to it, as well as relying more on practical effects than CGI.
Yeah, especially in horror. It works
exactly.
Really well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think if things get too CGI'd, it just kind of takes away from the horror element, because you're like, well, that doesn't seem real,
Right.
If it seems like it could be real, it's usually a lot scarier. So yeah, overall, really cool story there. I've always kind of been a fan of Swamp Thing, and I was looking forward to going through this. So yeah, I'm glad we did. Definitely check this book out, or any of the Alan Moore Swamp Thing stories. So yeah, let's do our cultured picks for this week. What was your pick for this week?
This week I picked Nightwing 102. This is obviously a continuation of Nightwing 101. And it kind of, it's really interesting, because at the end of 101, there's kind of this shapeshifter that takes the place of Dick Grayson. And so he's kind of pretending to be with the Titans. And so Dick, it starts this issue, wakes up in like a morgue, and he has to kind of escape that. And it's really, really cool. Obviously, it's building up towards the Titans book that's going to happen soon. I think it's the same creative team. So they're basically this is sort of like a preamble to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, and I think I might have mentioned this earlier, but I'm not the biggest fan of Tim Taylor's writing. I'm obviously didn't really like issue 100, as you probably remember. But this is it's one of the better ones, I think, but it's still not necessarily my favorite.
Okay, gotcha. So my cultured pick this week is Dark Web. It says Dark Web #1 like on the cover, but in every other time it's mentioned, it's called Dark Web Dusk. So the thing about the Dark Web thing is it's one of those series that has so many different spin-offs and whatnot, so many different like side series. But if you kind of want to just collect like the main Dark Web series, there's 2 one-shots. There's this one, Dark Web 1, or Dark Web Dusk, and then there's Dark Web Finale #1 or Dark Web Dawn. And then in between that, well, actually, before that, Amazing Spider-Man 14 is the prelude.
Okay.
And then 15 through 18 are like the main Amazing Spider-Man 15 through 18 are like the main chunk of the Dark Web story. But kind of where this issue, I mean, I guess I'm kind of reviewing the whole Dark Web thing right now, but because it's kind of hard, but I probably want to get into it more in depth on the show sometime. But it's basically 2 clones that turn evil is the idea. So we have Ben Reilly, who is a clone of Peter Parker.
Right.
He's honestly kind of an underrated character in my opinion. He was Spider-Man for a while, and people didn't like it, but whatever. But he was also the first Scarlet Spider.
Yeah.
So there's some other stuff that happened in like several previous issues where he got these weird powers, and he's not just spider powered, but he also lost all of his memories. At one point he was given Peter Parker's memories, and he had them stripped from him because he's not really Peter Parker, and he blames Peter for that. So he teams up with Madeline Pride, who is Jean Grey's clone, who is now king or queen of, she's the Goblin Queen, the queen of Limbo. Magic gave up her position as like leader of Limbo to kind of, as like a peace offering, but Ben ends up convincing Madeline to start a war with the surface world, basically, because she basically egging her on to revenge, because she's missing a lot of her memories. Like, she had a whole life with Scott, and they had a kid together and everything, because she thought she was Jean, but then the real Jean came back. There's like there's a lot of backstory in this, but they do kind of explain it in the books. They make enough mention of it that what's going on. And Ben's plan is to get Peter to like eat this like apple thing that's supposed to like steal his Peter's memories. And then if he eats the apple, then Ben will get Peter's memories, which he thinks are his memories. It's kind of like, I'm making it sound a little more complicated than it is, but it's a very cool series.
Yeah.
Especially like the Amazing Spider-Man, just the way it's very much a Spider-Man centered story, but then there's like a bunch of offshoots like Ms. Marvel Dark Web, X-Men Dark Web, Golden Goblin Dark Web, and Venom Dark Web. Oh, and Mary Jane and Black Cat Dark Web. So, but you don't need to read all those. You just kind of, if you want to read the Dark Web story, though, I would probably start with this one, though, just Dark Web #1. You don't really, either that or Amazing Spider-Man 14. You really don't need to know anything other than that, but it's pretty cool. But also, I forgot to mention, Ben Reilly's known as Chasm now, and he's just got this really cool, like, badass suit that like glows kind of a teal color, and it looks like almost like smoke coming off of him. It's just a very cool design they chose for him, and I think it's cool that they brought Ben Reilly back, and he's a villain now. So all in all, pretty cool. One of the cooler things Marvel's done recently, I think.
Cool.
So that is the episode. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to check out our previous 8 episodes right here on the same channel, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.
This has been the Cultured Pull List. If you would like to help support us to help us bring you more content, check us out at patreon.com/theculturednerd. And if you would like to support me and Luke specifically, look for our show's specific tier. Thank you to all of our current Patreon supporters. I have been your host, Michael Malillo, and my co-host is Luke S. Our logo and our visual assets were designed by Jose Navarro, and our intro was designed by myself. Thank you again for joining us. Please like and subscribe. And if you want to check out the Cultured Nerd on social media, scan the QR code on the bottom left. And if you want to check out Casual Experts, which is me and Luke's brand, scan the QR code on the bottom right.